Hello, Foreign Entanglements viewers. I am Dr. Rob Farley from the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce, and with me today is Dr. David Gartenstein-Ross. Why don't you introduce yourself?
David Gartenstein-Ross. I'm a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University in the Security Studies program.
Right, and the doctor is a recent addition, is that correct?
It certainly is. Finally earned the degree back in April.
Wait, is this your first? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, so now I'm part of the club, the handshake.
Is this your first, the first blogging heads you've done since finishing up?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I did one other, right after Twitter Fight Club was done with Kelsey Atherton,
Right.
and I think I might have had my PhD then, but not quite sure.
So today we are going to focus our conversation sort of more so this is the reason to talk about our credentials, to focus our conversation more on sort of a theoretical and academic dispute than on sort of some basic conceptualization or so basic current event stuff. What we're going to talk about is credibility and reputation and how credibility and reputation matter for foreign policy and international affairs. Because this matters, right? We're having a big conversation right now, and we hear a lot on Twitter, we hear a lot in the public sphere about how or whether or why reputation should matter for American foreign policy. And so, to start out by giving the conventional understanding of why reputation matters, your very basic bare bones argument, and you can stop me if you think I'm wrong. A very bare bones argument is one that sort of harkens back to the politics of the schoolyard, right? This idea that if we have a reputation for toughness, if we have a reputation for credibility, then people won't mess with us. And in academic parlance, this becomes part of a large body that has developed around deterrence theory that begins in the 1940s and 50s, but then works its way and becomes sort of one of the motivating sort of theories of American foreign policy. One of the ways that we can most closely attach political science work to actual foreign policy, with the argument becoming that to successfully deter an opponent, you need three things, right? You need interest, you need capability, and you need a reputation for resolve, right? That these three things together, if any of those are missing, you will not be able to successfully deter an opponent. And so the Powers states that lack a reputation for resolve, a reputation for keeping the commitments that they've made, will be challenged again and again by foreign powers who don't believe that they're going to follow through on their promises. Do you think that's a fair explanation of what deterrence theory, or not what deterrence theory, but what reputation and credibility theory? Right.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly fair.
Right. In recent years, and by recent I mean in about the last 15 to 20 years, but it's become sort of a little bit more vocal in the past 5 years, there are an increasing number of voices within political science, and primarily within political science who think about this sort of stuff, that have questioned whether this story of reputation is a little bit too simple. They have questioned sort of how do reputations form, how do states acquire reputations, how do states send messages, how do states understand messages. In a sense, complicating this very simple schoolyard story we have here, where one person is sending a message that is understood by a bully or by some other bad doer, a message of deterrence. And political scientists have begun to say, look, reputations don't form in this way, messages aren't sent and aren't understood in this way, and so it's probably not right to be conceiving of reputation within deterrence theory in the same way that we do in a lot of the popular discussion about popular conversation about foreign policy. And this has become particularly important in context of the famous Obama red line promise, where promise strikes against Syria if the Syrian government used chemical weapons. Backed down on that after the Syrian government repeatedly used chemical weapons. And this has then sort of opened up a wide avalanche of criticism, arguing that sort of events such as the Chinese ADIZ or the Russian invasion of Crimea or ISIS or whatever essentially happened because of this lack of credibility on the part of the United States.
or in other terms, are in some way influenced by. I mean, I think that and look, for any kind of discussion or debate, people are going to wildly misuse concepts. And so I think we're both in very clear agreement that often the idea of toughness or resolve or credibility is wildly overused. But I think the more reasonable argument, the one that is situated within the political science literature and what academics might say who believe in this thing called credibility, is that they're influenced by, with the exception, I think, of ISIS, which I don't think is influenced by U.S. credibility. But, for example, Russian actions may be influenced by, but there are lots of other reasons that Russia is doing what it's doing other than simply credibility.
Right. And so, well, I mean, I guess let me, and I should also say here that, and this is taking Peter Feaver. Peter Feaver is one of the few academics who's really a fervent believer that reputation and credibility matter. And he has argued, I think quite correctly, that this is one of the biggest disjunctures there is between the policymaking community and the academic community.
Yes.
Where, academics have serious questions and policymakers don't, right? I mean, policymakers seem absolutely committed to the notion that credibility and reputation matter, and credibility and reputation are worth paying costs for. So, I mean, I've talked a lot, so...
Actually, there's a reason why I've been so quiet, because as we mentioned just before coming on here, you and I've had this debate on Twitter, or a bit of this debate on Twitter a few times, and usually it proceeds... from you attacking the notion of credibility. You use the term credibility fairy. And I respond to that somewhat negatively, saying that I think that you're exaggerating the degree to which credibility doesn't matter. So I think that you've done a good job setting up the academic debate, but I'd actually like you to bear out your critique just a little bit more. So I'd put this question to you. Why do you feel that the notion that reputation, credibility matters in some real way is nothing more than a credibility fairy, in other words, kind of a fantasy type thing?
Because I believe that the theory, as we've specified it not only in the political science literature, but also in the popular argument, radically understates the complexity of the moving parts. I think that it takes as a given that states process information in a particular way, that they approach interpreting the actions of other states in a specific way. And I think that the reputation theory, in order to function, has to be sort of very specific in how it functions. The moving parts do have to work, and they have to work well together. And I think that, generally speaking, and I also think that the empirical work tends to support this, states don't think in the way that reputation credibility theorists need them to think in order for reputation and credibility theory to work. They don't approach analyzing and developing personality attributes of other states in the way we would need them to for credibility theory to work in the way that it's supposed to be. And in particular, it's a problem of messaging, right? That we think, sort of based on the schoolyard analogy, it is relatively simple to send a message of credibility and resolve. But as with every other message in international politics, the message we send is not necessarily the message that the other side receives. And the reputation we are trying to establish is not necessarily going to be the one that the opponent develops. And when you start asking questions like that, and you start opening up that can of worms, reputation theory runs into some very serious problems, because it requires a certain set of interpretations of the behavior of others.
All right, so I have one more question for you before destroying your argument, shattering all of your dreams, ruining your career, and undermining all the hopes that you've had for life. And that question is, there's basically two schools of thought questioning the notion of credibility and reputation. One is that there's not a generalized reputation. In other words, that what the U.S. red line in Syria doesn't have much of a bearing on Russia's decision to do what it did in Ukraine. Right. But that it may actually have an impact close to that action. In other words, there may be a regional effect or an effect on similar issues. The other one is a stronger version of that argument, which is what I normally interpret you as taking. But I think it's worth actually establishing this at the outset so that so we have common terms and a common set of concepts. The other argument, which I have perceived to be yours, is that reputation, there's no proof reputation matters, period. That even on similar issues, this is going to be determined much more by state interests and state capabilities, and not so much by states' perceptions of other states.
I'm not sure if exactly I would phrase it that way. I guess I am a partisan of the second school, but I wouldn't phrase it in the way that that you just phrased it, right? I mean, I do think that interests and capabilities tend to dominate, but I also think perceptions of other states are important. What I don't think is that State A, America, can control the way that other states perceive us in the way that reputation theory demands, right? Reputation theory demands that our actions, that we, in making decisions, that we take in undertaking policies, can have a significant and predictable impact on how others perceive us. And that's where I have significant doubts. I don't think that we can convince others that we have a particular reputation. And I think there's actually plenty of empirical evidence to suggest that people draw all kinds of bizarre lessons about American behavior that we don't perceive, that we don't understand, and that most importantly, we don't predict that they will draw. And that's why then you get to this larger argument that we should be really, really careful about ever spending any amount of blood and treasure to protect our reputation, right? Because it's essentially message sending, and the message we send is not the one they're going to get.
So do you think the next time the United States draws a red line, whether in the Middle East or elsewhere, that countries in assessing that red line and whether to cross it are going to look to the Syria example, or do you think that it's irrelevant? In other words, that credibility was not cost in this case, so the next red line will be completely unrelated to our failure to enforce the last one?
To be quite honest, I think that our next red line will be, even to the extent that policymakers in states who are sort of referring to this red line, right? I suspect that, and I think it's going to be very hard to suss out because you never know exactly how conversations would go with or without a particular framing, that in the end, the decision of whether or not to actually bomb Syria will have negligible to zero effect on decision-making of other states. Now, let me work through that for a second, right? Because it actually depends a little bit on the details. Let's consider what's the counterfactual in which we had bombed Syria, right? In which we had bombed Syria in order to maintain our reputation. We would then expect, if credibility and reputation theory are actually to work, that this would enhance our credibility, right? But what if we didn't bomb enough, right? What if we didn't fire enough cruise missiles? What if Assad still survived? Is your actor X down the road going to interpret this as, hey, the United States was credible? Or are they going to interpret this as, hey, the United States did not make good on their threat because they didn't overthrow Assad? We can then say, well, we didn't promise we were going to overthrow Assad. But that's not relevant here, right? The question is whether our delivering a certain number of cruise missiles or not to Syria is going to affect or is going to control how somebody perceives our actions down the road. And even if we, in our minds, match what we said enacting this red line, we don't ensure that somebody else is going to believe that we matched the red line.
All right, so this is where we get into the debate. And let me actually start the debate portion of this discussion by both agreeing with you about Syria and also specifying what I think is very useful about the academic critique of credibility theory and the notions of reputation. I agree with you that the failure in Syria would not have been ameliorated had the U.S. Done what, say, John Kerry said it was going to do and carry out incredibly small strikes against Syria. I mean, Kerry even used that phrase, we'll carry out these incredibly small strikes. To me, the problem with the Syrian red line, which I think is going to have a tremendous impact on our credibility and reputation, the problem was that we set the red line in the first place because our interests were insufficiently high to do anything to set up this very grandiose notion of a red line. It was very clear that when the red line was crossed, that the U.S. did not know how to respond. And I simply don't think, given the mess that Syria is, and given how much is going on there, and the fact that we have two different sides, both of which we're afraid of in different ways, I don't think there's anything we possibly could have done to enforce the red line and salvage our reputation. So my critique of what happened in Syria has always been not that we should have bombed, but rather that we shouldn't have set the red line in the first place. But I do think that the fact that we set the red line and then we're unwilling to enforce it, which is reasonable because we didn't have enough interest, is very damaging to the U.S. So turning to our agreement on Syria, albeit there's a disagreement embedded within it, but we both agree that once the red line was set, there really wasn't anything the U.S. could have done to live up to it. Let me turn to what I think is the good of this critique. I think that the academic critique and the critique that you advance does a very good job sharpening concepts. I think that there are ways both within previous academic literature and also within the way certainly that this is utilized by policymakers that sometimes people exaggerate the notion of credibility, the notion of reputation, and the very specific example that you pointed to, using military force simply to enforce reputation is sometimes something that is bandied about. I mean, we certainly saw that in the Syria debate, and I also have a problem with that. So I applaud the critique in that way. But here's where we get to my point of disagreement. This deals with the different ways in which practitioners and academics do see this. You pointed to Fever's argument, which I think is very perceptive, that practitioners and academics see this in very, very different ways. The practitioners taking it very seriously, and academics thinking that practitioners are basically crazy for seeing reputation as such an important thing. Obviously, we started off by talking about we're both within the same field, both have PhDs, and both to a greater or lesser extent have our foot in both academia and also the policy communities. And to me, one of the problems that I have with political science, where the discipline stands right now, is it has trouble taking seriously things that are difficult to measure. And this is exactly what my dissertation was on, albeit on a very different subject. The subject I looked at was the importance of religious ideas for jihadist organizations, which is something that often within the political science literature, and certainly the majority of peer-reviewed published work, takes the view that religion really just isn't all that important. Religious ideas aren't all that important. There are other material causes that are sufficient explanations, and I very strongly disagree with that. There are, of course, multiple causes embedded within this, just as in anything you have multiple causes. Any sort of simplistic view that says, oh, religion provides all the explanation or credibility or reputation does is going to be overly simplistic and hence won't have very good explanatory value. But one of the things that I've noted is that academics to date haven't done a very good job of trying to actually measure out religiosity as compared to other variables, which is something for Salafi jihadist groups I believe one can do, especially because for these organizations you actually have a lot of external indicators. Compare that to reputation.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that there's for those of you who are getting lost in this now, there's a baseball analogy to this, right? I mean, that stat heads for a very long time in baseball just were extremely reluctant to include metrics of fielding effectiveness because fielding is so much more difficult to measure than hitting, right? Hitting has all of this data that's right there and you can do whatever you want with it. Fielding is so much more. And so you talk to stat heads from like 1995 and they're like, fielding, why would that be important? Right? And sort of talking about it in terms of, well, you can't measure it. Just because you can't measure it doesn't mean that it's important. But, and I'm going to let you finish, but then I'm going to have a critique of your critique.
Sure. No, but I think that's actually a really good example. And just because I'm a baseball nerd as well, I want to play off of it a little bit. In fact, if you look at where sabermetrics led baseball in the 1990s, they helped to produce this. It helped to produce a steroid era. And I say that not out of dislike of sabermetrics, because I know that critique has been leveled against it, but rather, given that people thought that fielding didn't really matter, it makes sense to have bad fielders throughout your team, big guys who could hit home runs at shortstop and at third base and at positions that traditionally were fielding type positions. And then those sabermetrically advanced teams, that is those teams that had advanced analysis, started to realize the value of fielding and to see that similar to the way fielding was at one point overvalued, it had actually become undervalued. So they found hidden value there and started selecting a different type of player and actually looked at their metrics very, very differently. And so a player like Andrelton Simmons right now, one of the best fielding shortstops of all time, in the 1990s or early 2000s, he wouldn't have been out of a job, but he certainly would have been valued much less.
Right.
So to turn to this question of reputation, I think the strong idea that reputation simply doesn't matter is one that I disagree with. And here's why. Number one, I think that within a region, a reputation certainly carries over. So the next time the U.S. makes threats or says that it takes something very seriously in the Middle East, I think that the notion of reputation and credibility will factor into any decision making that actors have, and that they will certainly consider what happened in Syria, and that will be a big part of their calculations. Secondly, I think that when one undermines the credibility on a specific issue, it has an impact on how actors behave. And one of the, I think, classic examples of this is April Gillespie's conversation with Saddam Hussein prior to the first Gulf War, in which she talked about how the dispute between Iraq and Kuwait was an intra-Arab dispute. Now, there's lots of debate about how Gillespie's statement should have been interpreted, but I think one of the main things that it provided was the notion that U.S. interests on this were sufficiently low that the U.S. might not take military action, even though it was very clear that the U.S. had material interests in making sure that Iraq didn't control this vast amount of oil. I think that that's actually a good example of where issue-specific reputation made a difference. And as for more global factors, I think
I have to stop you there, David, because
sure.
I've read that conversation a number of times. I think everybody associated with political science, I don't think there's a reputational issue there. I mean, I think there's a confusion of language issue in the Kuwait, that two people left the conversation with two completely different understandings of what had happened in the conversation. I don't think it's a reputational issue. I think it's a communication issue.
Well, it can be both, though. I think that it was certainly a communication issue. I don't think that Gillespie thought that Saddam Hussein would come away with the same impression that he did. But credibility, as you defined it before, pertains to resolve, capability, and interests. And in this case, I think that what Saddam Hussein perceived related very much to credibility as you defined it, in that it related to U.S. interests. And to him, Gillespie's statement meant that U.S. interest in acting was very low. I don't think Gillespie meant to put that forward, but I think that situationally, it affected the reputation of the United States in that he believed that U.S. interests were low.
Right, but that's not the question we're debating here. The question we're debating here is really this issue that's very specific on reputation, right? And I would have to go back and rewind exactly what I said, but to my recollection of what I was saying, it was that we do have to disaggregate these three parts of deterrence theory, of deterrence claims, which are power, which are interest, and which are resolve, right? The willingness to pay costs in order to defend our interests and our power. And again, I mean, I think, here, Saddam Hussein is making, a straightforward interest calculation based on how he thought that a conversation had gone, right? I don't think he's assessing the U.S. as having a weak reputation for resolve. He may have assessed from the conversation that the U.S. just didn't have that much interest in the region, but that's not a reputational question.
Well, it is based on how you defined it, right? Like, so let me first say I agree with you. We should disaggregate these three things. We should disaggregate resolve, capability, and interests. But all three, resolve, capability, and interests, are part of reputation. That's what you put forward at the beginning of this conversation. That's consistent with Jonathan Mercer's definition of what credibility is. That it includes all three. And so, are you conceding that if part of this, that if the U.S. has a reputation that its interests are low in a certain thing, that other countries will take that into account.
What I have come to this entire conversation with is this concentration not on interest and capabilities, but this concentration on resolve. Right. The only thing about this conversation that is interesting to me is the issue of resolve. Right, which is. And which I thought I was trying to do. And again, we can rewind and see what I actually said, maybe after. But it's this issue of resolve that's important to me, not the issue of the issues of capability and interest, which everyone grants are important. Right? Okay. Even people who are sort of deeply skeptical about reputational and credibility theories think that power and interest are important, right? It's the question of whether a reputation for resolve, which is how Mercer phrases it, a reputation for resolve or a reputation for irresolution, whether that's important. Right?
Okay, so we have another point of common ground, that if the U.S.'s reputation, if the interest-based portion of the U.S.'s reputation seems to be low, then people are not going to find the U.S. to be credible on that issue. So because you frame this as being the credibility theory, So I came into this looking at all three parts of credibility, but really it's the resolve fairy.
It's the resolve fairy that's most important to me. But the credibility fairy is a shorthand because people conflate the credibility and the resolve. Right, most of the conversations we see about this in the public sphere, and even in the academic to some extent, but especially in the public sphere, are overwhelming with this issue of resolve. Right, does the U.S. have sufficient resolve?
But this is important in terms of clarifying a bit what is meant, because when you talk about, and you've said this before on Twitter, and let me caveat all of this by saying Twitter is of course shorthand, right? It's 140 characters, so it doesn't have the sort of caveats and footnotes that you would have in an academic paper. But I've seen you say multiple times that people talk about credibility, but they can't show that credibility has ever mattered. And here you agree that in the first Gulf War, credibility, and I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but I think you're saying it may have mattered because it may have left Saddam Hussein with a different understanding of U.S. interests. That would be an example of credibility.
No, I mean, again, I think you're misinterpreting my claims here, right? I mean, what credibility is referencing here is the United States' reputation for resolve, is the United States' willingness to back up claims that it's making, right?
But resolve is only one of three parts of credibility. I mean, this is how you define it. This is how Mercer defined it. Mercer writes, credibility consists of resolve, capability, and interests. And so if interests are perceived to be low, then U.S. credibility will be low on that issue because the U.S. is seen as having low interests. So,
no, that's true. That's fair.
So that part of credibility, the interest-based part of credibility, as well as the capability part of credibility, both of those you agree matter. It's the resolve part that you don't think matters, correct?
That's fair. Right. No, that's fair. That's true.
So, but that it's also important because that's something different than what you've said previously. And again, the caveat that when you say credibility, you're using that as being synonymous with resolve. But you've said previously that you don't think anybody has shown that credibility matters. So when I read that, and I think of, for example, the first Gulf War or interests where for specific reasons, specific things that the U.S. did, its interest was seen as being low. Like, I look at that statement and I say, no, here are counterexamples. And if they're interest-based, you actually would say, okay, those are fair. I agree with those. I just don't think resolve matters, right?
Right.
Okay. So we can focus in the rest of the discussion then on the issue of resolve, because I also do think that resolve matters. But again, in the context of...
You think a reputation for resolve matters. How would we say that? Yeah, okay.
Correct. I think a reputation for resolve matters. Within the context of course, some people exaggerate that, but you and I would both agree, I'm certain, that the fact that some arguments are deployed poorly doesn't mean that it invalidates a concept, because everybody is going to deploy some argument poorly. So with respect to resolve specifically... I would limit my agreement with that statement. I would say that there are strong limits on how useful some concepts can be, and that some concepts are so poorly specified and so poorly understood that they actually... the use of them substantially detracts from our understanding of the issues. Oh, certainly.
And I think actually, and I'll even you can see where I'm going here. But my argument is going to be our understanding here on reputation and resolve is going to be one that, what we understand about it is far too limited to make any sort of significant public claims as to the impact of resolve and reputation.
Yeah, and to be sure, that is a point of disagreement, right? I'm just kind of framing at the outset, and I guess I should stop saying at the outset since we're like 30 minutes to this discussion already. But I was just framing that, an endorsement by me of the notion that a reputation for resolve matters is not an endorsement of things like we should have bombed Syria because we set this red line. As we talked about before, I don't think that would have made a difference. I think that the reputational harm was already done when we applied the red line to something where our interests were so low. But I think that if, for example, we're dealing with another state actor in the Middle East and we lay down a red line, the fact that we did not enforce the red line previously that we had laid down will absolutely be remembered and will factor into that calculation. I think that the important part of your critique, which I at least partially agree with, is, and in fact even more than partially, I think there is a lot of merit to the idea that there's a lot we don't know about how reputation for resolve is A, attained, and B, what impact it has on international affairs. So it is difficult to make claims about that definitively, particularly within the academic literature. There's a lot, in my view, that we don't know. Nonetheless, I do think that it plays a role in how decisions are going to be made, how they're going to be made within the region, and even I would say more broadly, but I don't need to really get into that because this gets into, for example, Schelling's idea of credibility, which has been widely widely condemned within the academic literature. But to get to this is where we get to the practitioner-academic split, which is that I think there's a reason practitioners and academics look at this differently. For academics, we want to be careful about the concept because we don't sufficiently understand it. So we don't know specifically how reputation is attained, what the impact is going to be in decision making, how much of an impact that will have, and thus how it influences outcomes. For practitioners, on the other hand, I believe that there is good reason that they take it more seriously than academics, which is I think that the current academic understanding of reputation makes very good critiques about the concept, but undervalues that concept in the same way that Fielding was undervalued by sabermetricians in the 1990s. And practitioners who have to deal with the consequence of their actions and the outcome of those actions thus place a little bit more value on it. And I'm not saying that practitioners get it right, academics get it wrong, but I will say that at the very least, the notion that reputation for resolve doesn't matter is undervaluing the concept. And I think that if we're able to measure this better, which I'm not sure we will, we'll see that at the very least, the current academic extreme skepticism was undervaluing where it actually should be.
Right. All right. So two ways of coming back. First, on your argument about that the next time the United States has established a red line, that people are going to take seriously what just happened in Syria. The United States has established dozens of red lines in the Middle East right now. Right. We have a whole series of red lines which are associated with Iranian behavior, which are associated with Jordanian, Egyptian, Syrian behavior. These red lines aren't even spoken of because it's so obvious that the United States will respond that we don't need to talk about them. Right. Iran doesn't think that mining the Straits of Hormuz has suddenly become acceptable just because we didn't bomb Syria, right? And so we didn't need to achieve a reputation for resolve in this case because our interests and our capabilities were so obviously leaning in this direction. What makes Syria interesting and special is it was something that was obviously outside of our interest, right? And so the next time the United States makes a declaration of something that is so obviously outside of its interest, that it really doesn't want to do, that it really ought not to do, then somebody may say, well, let's look back at the Syria situation. Do they really carry through on their threats that they're not, when they make threats about stuff they don't want to do in the first place?
Right.
But you know what? Bashir Assad and his lieutenants made exactly that same calculation a year and a half ago when they said, sure, the United States is making threats here, but it is not in the U.S. interest, and it is in no way, I guess it's just not in the U.S. interest, right? And they don't have the capability to actually change the thing that they're trying to change, right? They're going to make the same calculation 2 years down the road. The next time we say we are going to do something that we don't want to do, they're going to be able to figure out that we don't want to do it. And they're going to make the same calculation as Assad did here, right? Our reputation failed, right? Our threat failed, despite the fact we had just, in many minds, established a reputation for resolve with respect to Libya, right? Where we had done something that we really didn't want to do all that much, right? We kind of were dragged into the Libya war by the French and the British. It was clear Obama wasn't interested in it. But we established a reputation there for doing stuff we didn't want to do, right? But it didn't change the fact that Assad looked again at this and says, look, interest and capabilities. They don't want to do it, and they don't really have the capability to overthrow my regime with anything they're going to use. That was how he made his judgment. That's how they're going to make their judgment 3 years down the road. It's the same way that the Iranians are going to make a different judgment with respect to the mining of the Straits of Hormuz. They do have the capability. They do have the interest. The Syrian example is absurd because it's a completely different situation. They're going to measure on interest and capability.
So for the mining of the Strait of Hormuz, we agree. But when there's an overwhelming U.S. interest, the fact that the U.S. didn't follow through when its interests were lower is not going to make a difference. So that's a point of agreement.
You can't establish a reputation for resolve for defending Florida, right? I mean, that's sort of one part of this argument, right? Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, I think there's two areas where reputation for resolve would make a difference. One of which is what you put your finger on, where U.S. interests are low, but a very clear threat is made. And there's a second one, where there are U.S. interests, but action is messy. And for this, I'd get to Assad's previous experience with the United States. Let's remember that his experience with the U.S. Red Line is not his first experience with the U.S. in recent years in the Middle East. Rather, you had another set of events which was very important and which I do think relates to U.S. credibility, involving both Iran and also Assad. For Iran, it was supporting insurgent factions, first in Iraq and later in Afghanistan, that were killing Americans. Iran did this very slowly at first, then massively, especially in Iraq, escalated its support for these factions and never paid any sort of significant price for it. Likewise, Assad did the same thing. He allowed foreign fighters to transit from Syria into Iraq and paid no price for it during this period. There was a very clear U.S. interest at the time. There was a very clear U.S. interest in making sure that American soldiers were not being killed and that countries like Iran and Syria were not helping insurgent factions. But also, any sort of action would have been messy. But I think that as a result, as they tested the waters and there was no price that was paid, they saw the U.S. reputation as non-credible, or reputation for resolve as non-credible in this particular area, and so ratcheted up action over time.
I mean, that's fine, but I mean, I don't see how that then applies to this issue of Assad making the judgment with respect to. I mean, you are really sort of you are opening up a degree of knowledge of the decision making in the Assad regime that we don't have access to, that we don't even come close to having access to, right? And it seems sort of a strain beyond, I'm going to use this word, credibility, to me to say that Assad makes a judgment about U.S. Reluctance to engage Syrian militias in 2007, and then comes to the conclusion that the United States is not going to support its red line in 2012. Were I Assad, or were I judging Assad, I would find an explanation just as credible to think that the United States would take every advantage of an opportunity to hurt the Assad regime as much as possible if the Assad regime does something wrong, right? And so the story you just told sounds to me like a fabulous story that one tells after the fact, rather than a story with any kind of predictive content.
Well, I agree with you on the first part, that we don't have sufficient information, and I want to get back to that in a second. But it seems to me, I mean, you say that it seems non-credible that Assad would take this into account. To me, it seems non-credible that he wouldn't. I mean, this is,
Actually, David, what I said was it doesn't lead to wonder in one particular direction or another particular direction, right? He could do this, and he could take it into account, and he could understand this in terms that would make the United States more likely to take action now, especially when the United States has withdrawn from Iraq, so capability is higher. And especially when the Syrian regime is weaker, which it certainly was. It would be so my story about Assad's decision-making is a priori every bit as plausible as the story you're trying to tell, right?
Well, I think that actually, look, if you're gaming out how such a decision would be made, I think that they would look at both stories, right? Like, I think both stories are things that would be taken into account. Maybe the U.S. would act in this way, maybe it would act in the other way. And reputationally, when they're looking at it in my direction, they'd say, well, you had a much more hawkish administration, much more clear U.S. interests, and still there was no price that we paid for this. Now, looking at it your way, they'd say, but maybe the U.S. would look at this as an opportunity for revenge, given what we did previously, given that we're weaker now. I mean, you'd have to game both things through. And ultimately, this gets back to the issue of incomplete information. We don't know how they looked at this. We don't know if they seized on my story and said, look, the U.S. just isn't going to act. Or it's not clear whether they looked at yours and said, well, maybe this is an opportunity to get back at us. And this lack of perfect information point is where I think we get to the practitioner-academic split. And to me, I think that just as practitioners should consider that maybe their concepts should be sharpened, I think academics also need to understand the context in which practitioners are acting, and understand also that the current academic understanding, as more complete information becomes available, may prove to be wrong. So I think that academics also need to be more humble in what maybe can be shown, and understand that just because something can't be proven doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
I gotcha. And here's where I'm going to come back on this as well. So our current preoccupation with resolve and reputation is not something that is sort of this this enduring part of international politics, right? Certainly, there have always been, some understandings of national honor and national reputation and so forth. But the specific way that you and I and policymakers today are approaching credibility, and the way that critiques of policymaking have approached credibility since the beginning of the Cold War, have been embedded within a particular academic understanding of what reputation means, of what resolve and reputation, or of how resolve contributes to this reputation, which also shares with credibility and interest, right? And so policymakers are not acting in a theory-free zone, right? They are acting in a zone where the theories we have, and they read the Schelling, and we read Schelling at the Patterson School. I'm sure you read Schelling. Right, the Schelling, which has this relatively sophisticated but also unproblematic understanding of how reputation is supposed to matter, of how resolve is supposed to matter, right? This contributes to the understandings that policymakers have of reputation and resolve. So they are not operating in the zone that is free from academia. In fact, they are operating within a very clear set of academic understandings of why resolve and reputation matter. And it's a Cold War understanding, and it's a Cold War understanding that's left over because so many of the people are left over from the Cold War. And so many of the people, and I won't name names here, but you may have noticed on Twitter, the absolute strongest proponents of the credibility theory are almost always old Russia hands, right? They are almost always people who grew up working in this Cold War context in which reputation and resolve mattered so much with respect to the Russians. And these are the people who have the strongest sort of almost visceral feeling that reputation and that resolve must matter, that we can't look weak in front of the Russians. So you say, oh, academics should be humble. You're right. We should have been humble a while ago. And now we should call out instances where we feel that policymakers are acting according to an obsolete understanding of how we think resolve and reputation work. You may be right that the critique we're making now, if they come up with and I'm going to be, I'll be a bit light here, but reputils, right, where the United States has a specific number of reputils that'll never happen, right? But this solves the measurement issue, right? And so maybe we will solve the measurement issue. And Peter Feaver even said, look, 10 or 15 years from now, we'll have good dissertations on why reputation matters. If that's the case, then academics should, by any sort of sense of responsibility, start talking about, hey, well, this is our understanding of how reputation matters. This is how we ought to advise policymakers on this. But right now, what we understand about reputation is that it is extremely hard to translate it into some understanding of how states behave. And so the amount that we should spend in terms of blood and treasure to maintain our reputation for resolve, the state of the art says very little, right? That this is not something that we think should be considered all that important.
Right. And I think you are saying two different things that perhaps aren't irreconcilable. Mm-hmm. I mean, my view is not that we should expend blood and treasure to attain a reputation for resolve, mm-hmm. but rather that we should, when things are not in our interests, mm-hmm. we should be very hesitant to make any sort of threat. And that, if we do, we should be willing to act. We should understand what it means if a country violates those red lines. And so I think that, A, reputation can be attained, mm-hmm. And B, we should actually work to attain reputation on these issues. Mm-hmm. And that on such issues, and again, I put them into two categories. One category being where U.S. interest is low, but the U.S. is making threats. And B, where there are U.S. interests, like the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but where action is complicated. And I think that for both of those, I think reputation does matter. Mm-hmm. It's hard to attain the right reputation, but I think very clearly, doing things like threatening red lines and having no idea what it means if that red line is violated does not help gather the right reputation.
So you want to take the bluff away from U.S. strategic policymaking?
I want to take the bluff away in areas where U.S. interests are low. Right? In areas where U.S. interests are high, I'm certain there's a fair.
But if U.S. interests are high, there's no need to bluff, right? You're not bluffing if your interest in your capabilities are high. You're just telling the truth, right? You bluff when your interests are low because you hope that others will will not be able to see through your bluff, and that you won't be called on it, and you won't actually do something. That's in fact the whole point behind reputation theory, right? And the idea here, and the sort of the broadest idea is that, had we followed through in Syria, we would have been able to bluff through Crimea, right? We would have been able to say, don't attack Crimea, and that people would have believed our bluff because we had lobbed a few cruise missiles at Syria. And I understand that that's not a position you hold, but that's what a lot of people who maybe should know better do argue, right? And that seems absurd to me, right? We should be able to bluff.
I think taking the bluff way is a decent way of putting it, and the answer is I would. Take the bluff away. The reason why is I think that when the U.S. was during what's been called the U.S.'s unipolar moment, I think we had a high ability to bluff because during the 1990s, prior to 9/11, the U.S. had very low military commitments. It was clear that we had a massive military force, massive economic force, and were the undisputed superpower of the world. At that time, the U.S. had an amazing ability to bluff on any issue anywhere. I think over the past 13 years, as the U.S. has had more military commitments overseas, as the U.S. economy has weakened, as other countries have caught up to the United States, our bluffs will increasingly be challenged. So in many ways, I see the Obama administration's red line bluff in Syria as being you mentioned kind of outmoded thinking. To me, it's outmoded thinking of the U.S. as being in the same situation where it was during the 1990s in some ways. But I think that our bluffs don't mean the same thing.
Let me give you another example. Right after China established its air defense zone, air defense identification zone in the East China Sea, and it should be noted that this was also people who favor on Twitter and elsewhere reputation theory was that this is the fruit of the Syrian red line, that the Chinese are establishing this ADIZ. The United States flew a couple of B-52s right through it without alerting the Chinese. And it was perfect, right? Because B-52 is a plane you cannot possibly not see, right? And so we're not going to alert them about flying these gigantic planes through. And the Chinese did nothing. Nothing, right? I mean, they did nothing which came through with the basic implication of what an air defense identification zone should do, right? I mean, they tried to challenge the planes. The planes didn't make any comment. It was obvious the Chinese were bluffing about what they were going to do with aircraft that came through the air defense identification zone. Would you follow through on the statement you just made and say that states like China should not use a bluff as part of their foreign policy toolkit, and that Russia should not use a bluff as part of their foreign policy toolkit?
I'm indifferent to whether they should or not. I mean, look, that's an area where, similar to the U.S. red line in Syria, it's clear that Chinese interests were so low that shooting down the B-52s would have been a disastrous move for China. And so, I think that they shouldn't have put forward that idiotic bluff in the first place, as a matter of strategy. I just don't think that was good strategy. Just like I think that putting down a red line in Syria where we're not willing to enforce it, and it might be challenged. I think there are a variety of reasons that it was challenged, including Iranian interests. You mentioned that the U.S. has several red lines with Iran, some of which we clearly, if they're violated, will act upon, like the mining of the Strait of Hormuz. Others of which are a little bit more vague. I mean, we have there's a complex process of negotiations with respect to the nuclear program where both the U.S. and Iran are feeling out each other's limitations and how both countries are willing to act. And I think that for these subtler moves, reputation for resolve does make a difference. And so you have two different areas of reputation for resolve, one of which is the bluff, clearly laying down a red line, where my view is that the U.S. shouldn't do that. The other of which is more subtle areas. And those are the areas where I think that actually reputation we will find actually is fairly important. Not for the big policy areas where it's literally matters of war and peace or striking at another country. For areas like that, I think that material interests will tend to predominate, with reputation being more important at the margins. But I think for the subtler decisions, reputation, we will find at some point, plays a more important role. Not that it's necessarily determinative, but that these are the areas where it's important. And look, at the end of the day, what we're both calling for is for political science to become to get more specific and as much as we can to study. I think I'm a little bit more skeptical than you are, perhaps, of our ability to actually attain this understanding. But I mean, I think there's some common ground, and I think that where we see things differently is on, well, is this notion of reputation actually going to matter? I mean, I guess as a final thing I'll say is it seems like you might even agree that in the areas that I'm pointing to, these are areas where it really might make a difference. But we both agree that it's not really measured very effectively within academia at this point.
Right. I mean, I guess I would follow up with, and this is, I kind of wanted to add this to the conversation previously. If academics, and with the advantage of 100 years of hindsight, and this is, of course, Mercer's work on World War I, if with the advantage of 100 years of hindsight and all of the archives from all of the states, can't sort through whether reputation mattered for the beginning of World War I, right? Can't figure out whether how policymakers interpreted reputation, whether they interpreted it correctly, whether it mattered for their decision making. If we can't come up with that now, then policymakers are up shit creek without a canoe trying to sort through reputation right now, right? And if it's that hard to measure, policymakers should be really, really careful when they try to do anything based on reputational considerations, right? Because it's that hard to measure. We don't know how to measure it. With 100 years of history, we don't know how to measure it. And maybe in the future we will be, but that's a different question. And so they should be, and I guess this has been part of my argument the whole time, extremely careful about thinking about reputation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the area where we agree on is they should be very careful about committing blood and treasure with the sole purpose of trying to establish our reputation. I think the flip side of this is I think we should, like my view, because I think reputation matters, is we should be careful about putting our reputation on the line where we're not willing to act. And this gets to the issue of whether we should either take out, or I think a better term would be to diminish the bluff in U.S. foreign policy. I think that our bluffs are going to be called more often, and actually I think this deals with both two aspects of credibility, both capability, number one, because U.S. capability has declined, and number two, reputation for resolve. I think that as U.S. bluffs are called and the U.S. doesn't act, people will be more likely to call the U.S.'s bluff, and that actually gets squarely back to the issue of reputation for resolve. I mean, because I know that we've been going at this for some time, and I know that we need to wrap up a bit. But so look, why don't we, if it works for you, we can wrap this up in the same way that we started. Like you can tell exactly why you think this doesn't matter, and I can come back at you with why it does.
Well, I mean, I think I've made clear why I think it doesn't matter, right? That and we sort of, when you grant that it's so hard for us to measure that we can't understand, how our moves are, and that political scientists can't really measure what's going on here, and that's sort of the problem with why political scientists don't really think this is important, because it's really hard to measure. And the fielding stats are an important caveat to this, right? But if we can't measure it, policymakers can't measure it, and if policymakers can't measure it, then policymakers should be really careful about doing anything. So that's a very summary of my position. With respect to just the bluff specifically, I would say that watching Vladimir Putin has been. David, can you hear me?
Sure can.
All right, we lost the video, but we still got the audio, so we'll just go ahead with that. Vladimir Putin has been extremely productive with respect to using the bluff strategically, and maybe that's because he has a wonderful reputation for resolve. But what that means in the end is that bluffing should be part of the toolkit for the United States, and that sometimes our bluffs are going to get called, and we're not going to follow through on them, and that's a good thing.
And there, what I'd come back with is we should be very careful about committing to bluffs when our bluffs may be called. I don't think we should never use them, but at the very least, we should figure out what we're going to do if a bluff is called, number one. And number two, figure that out in some way that can maintain credibility, which I think wasn't done within Syria. But look, at any rate, this is, I think, fielding statistics is a good way to kind of summarize my portion of this debate. That eventually, I think we will know more. I certainly wouldn't either take credibility or reputation for resolve and put them outside the arsenal of things that might matter to the United States. My feeling is that we'll find that they do matter. I don't think your critique is invalid. I think it is valid, as I said at the very outset. I think that it helps to sharpen the way we're thinking about this, but at the same time, I think, particularly your Twitter statements, which, as we talked about, never, Twitter's bad for caveating. But I think that you overstate the force of the critique. I think that, and that, in my view, has come out during the course of this conversation, where we're allowed for much more nuance and detail, which at the end of the day, as we've walked through all of this, I see as there are clear areas of disagreement, but I see it as much less of a debate than a discussion where there are a few areas of uncertainty. Right. And the question is, where we put the thumb, where we put the weight in those areas of uncertainty, what is most likely within them.
Right. I will give some consideration to changing the credibility fairy hashtag to the resolve fairy hashtag, if that'll make you happy.
Well, if I wanted to kind of round off the conversation, I would make some threat like I'll block you or unfollow you otherwise, and then you could test my reputation for resolve, right?
That'll get you 75 reputils, I think, right? You can just collect them and pile them up.
And then eventually I'll cash them in and, win my 10,000th follower.
Right, there we go. All right, well, thanks for having a good conversation, David, and Foreign Entanglements viewers, thank you so much for staying with us.